Of all the elements in the exhibit process, label writing, or translating the interpretive message into labels, is probably one of the most difficult, problematic, and underutilized forms of interpretation in museum exhibits. Some of the most frequently asked questions about label writing involve: what kinds of labels should be used? How many words in each kind of label? What style of language? How do you write for the average visitor? What sizes of type should be used? Where should they be placed? What form of interpretation is best used in labels? How do you attract and hold visitors' attention to the labels? And what makes an effective label? And how do you evaluate that effectiveness? Well, those are a lot of questions, and I think that probably style and length are two of the most relevant questions regarding how to appeal to the heterogeneous museum audience and how much should an exhibit label try and do. So those are going to be kind of the two focal questions that we're going to work on today. To explore these questions and to try and come up with some answers, a good way to begin is to start thinking about the types of labels that are going to be used in an exhibit. Good labels are the result of good planning, and each label should have its objectives clearly defined from the beginning. There are 6 different fundamental types of exhibit labels, and I'll be showing you some slides of each of those different kinds, ranging from the broadest, largest title category to the most specific small identifier labels. First of all, every exhibit needs a title label, and the purpose of this is to attract attention and inform the visitor about the basic subject matter of the exhibit. Now, in this slide, there's simply one label that says "Exploring a Museum's Attic." That's the only label in the whole exhibit. It also functions as a directional label, and it even has a little piece of non-exhibit information on it about not smoking. It names the exhibit and clearly distinguishes it from other exhibits. Often a second type of label, a subhead, is used to further identify and inform. And a subhead is important, especially when the title alone does not fully convey the subject or mood of the exhibit. In the slide of Teaching Teachers, the subhead is Education in Wisconsin, 1900 to 1980. There's also graphics which play a subtitle role in this sort of entrance area of the exhibit. Often a catchy title must be explained by a subheading. There should be only one title, but there can be more than one subhead, especially if the exhibit is broken into several different distinct units. And in this example, the different types of plant groups are named in the exhibit. Every exhibit also needs an introductory label to introduce the exhibit's theme and also give a brief overview or summary of the exhibit. In this, Illinois Pioneer Life has a long introductory label. It's probably a little bit too long. Looks like there's close to 250 words. Probably around 150 would be enough for any introductory label. The reason for having an introductory label is so that visitors can read it and decide whether or not they want to go any further in the exhibit. Often in large exhibits, large museums, there's so many exhibits that you want to be able to make a choice and spend your time where you're most interested in the subject matter. They may even make the decision after reading the introductory label to not go any further, and this should be their choice. The next 3 types of labels, group labels, captions, and specimen identifications, all refer directly to the artifacts on exhibit. The function of the group label is to develop specific ideas relating to a group of objects, one label for several things. The function of a caption label is to interpret individual objects on exhibit. A caption is more than an identifier. They are meant to be long enough and complete enough to be interpretive and may range from 10 to 50 words, or in some cases even more. In this art museum label, it was quite long and fascinating and sort of untypical for art museum labels. The 6th type of label is the identification label, which gives the basic facts of names, titles, dates, donors. There's no interpretation. It's simply meant to identify. Often not in full sentences also. If we look, however, at the way that most people tend to view museum exhibits, we see that they may glance at the title, skip the introductory label, and begin browsing or window shopping through the exhibit until they spot something that interests them. And there they read the label, where they've been motivated by their interest in the object. So they're not really following our pattern of reading the labels in the order that we've intended them to read them. This means that the burden of the interpretive message falls onto the caption labels to carry the themes of the display and to relate those objects to the viewer in an interpretive way. How then can we write the best kind of caption labels? Well, one way that has proven helpful in these workshops is to show people a model or example of very well-planned, successful captions. And the model that we've used is that of the National Geographic magazine Legends, those captions underneath the photographs in the magazine. If we think of a National Geographic magazine article as a museum display, we can see the same components. The photographs are the artifacts on display. There is usually a title, often a subtitle, caption labels, and an ID label. And in this example of the National Geographic article called Triumph and Tragedy on Annapurna, the identifier label would be corresponding to that of the identifying the author. The body of the story, or the text of the magazine article, corresponds to the museum's exhibit catalog. It's only for a minority of the audience, those keenly interested in the subject. How do people read the National Geographic? How do you read it? You probably pick it up, you start from the back, flip through until you see an interesting photograph, and then you stop and read the caption. This is sort of analogous to somebody wandering through an exhibit. You're just looking for something that interests you, and then you read the caption. Well, the writers of the National Geographic magazine know that people look at the magazine this way, and so they write the captions to suit that form, to suit that approach. And that's why the legends in the magazine are considered somewhat of an art form. Well, what are the elements of the style of caption labels in the magazine? And if you analyze them, and we suggest that you do this as an exercise on your own, you will probably find the following elements. If you read them all and read all of the captions in one article, you'll probably find these elements. There is an average of 15 to around 20 words per sentence. There is an average of 120 to 160 syllables per 100 words. And these are two measures used in gearing or analyzing the readability of material. And if you convert those two factors of 15 words per sentence and 120 syllables per 100 words, you come up with a reading of around an average reading level of 6th to 8th grade. So they're gearing their level of reading at not a very high level of sort of grade equivalent, but this is appropriate for a general audience. The captions tend to be short. The shortest captions contain around 20 words, and a few of the longer captions may run up to 100 words. They're really not all that brief. There's enough information to be interpretive, but not too much to be boring. This should also be true for your museum labels. There should be enough information to carry the story and themes along in full sentences. Whether they are longer or shorter depends on the objects being interpreted. Some objects have more to say than others. To set a strict limit on the number of words for every caption label is boring and repetitive. I was recently at a national park, the Volcano National Park, and it looked as if they had made a limit on the number of words that they were going to put on those labels that they had next to things. And even the most largest, the biggest crater, the active volcano, had the same number of words as all the other labels. And it seemed like in some places you really wanted more information, and they could be more responsive to the actual things that they're labeling by allowing a variety of numbers of words. In the legends, looking at the examples again in the National Geographic, you can see that there's usually a bold type lead-in. This is meant to be an eye-catcher. In addition to catching the eye, they catch the imagination through the use of catchy, colorful language, including alliteration and metaphors. The lead-in and the first part of the legend always refer to what can be seen in the photographs. Now, in museums where the visitor is right there looking at the objects, it is a very immediate, present tense experience. And you should be writing captions that start with the specifics which are visible and then work to the more general. Again, in the National Geographic style, you find that there are no first word articles. They don't use the, this, and that for the first word to start. They use a lot of quotations, which gives it a nice, more human kind of feeling. And the verbs that they use are active verbs. They avoid the verb to be. They avoid is, was, were. Now, the active voice and combining the active voice with the concrete visible information keeps the legend content related directly to what can be seen in the pictures. The active voice will also keep your labels in museums alive and interesting. We hear complaints that people don't read labels. Why should they if the labels don't have anything to do with the objects that are right in front of you? This technique alone, if used by museum label writers, concrete specific content rather than broad abstract concepts, would improve the overall quality of museum exhibits. Let's take a look at how some of these elements of style and other techniques can add interest and humanity to museum labels. I want to caution you just a little bit that these slides and the ones I showed before are selected for their label content, not their design or production aspects. So we're not evaluating the whole exhibit, we're just looking at what's in the labels. Observable facts are good to include. This label talks about how the logger's pants were cut off just below the boot top. They called this stagging the pants, and it's sort of a logger's trademark. When a tree was falling down on you, you could run faster if your pants were stagged. The use of active verbs is very important. In this label, for a small cannon, the words include fired at reveille and retreat, to announce official gatherings, the cannon gave its final salute. All of these words are very evocative for what that object is. The use of quotations. This bell, the quote says, also sounded at the 9 o'clock curfew when every kid was off the streets or had a good excuse why he wasn't home. I know I was one of those kids. Well, that kind of a punchline to your label can help keep it interesting and sort of reward the viewer for reading, the reader for reading all the way through the label also. This is a bilingual label from Canada. It tells you to watch out for the glacial goop. This is using experience that you can expect your visitors to have in the labels to reinforce them for reading. And it says, you may find yourself knee-deep in this soupy muck, and indeed we did find ourselves in it, as you can see from this slide. The use of questions, humor, and catchy titles can all increase your label's attracting and holding power. In these examples, you can see how those techniques apply. Let's also cover some do's and don'ts regarding the design and production of labels. Regardless of how you make your letters, whether you letter by hand, as in this California horn shark example, use a Leroy letterer or some other mechanical device, including a typewriter. The most common typewriter style is the Orator large capital letters. Whether you punch them out with a machine that cranks out one at a time the letters that you want, or buy them already punched out, or whether you use the familiar press type, which is most museum people are familiar with, or if you get a typeset on the photo typesetting machine, there are certain rules that apply for any of these methods. First of all, don't use all capital letters in the body copy. It just increases the difficulty of reading. If copy is longer than 20 words or more than 2 lines long, use regular upper and lower case. And you can do this with typewriters also. There is an Orator ball that has the upper and lower case, not the all capitals, that's available. There's also the old IBM executive typewriter, the one with the proportional spacing bar, which is a pain to use, but it does give proportional spacing in large type. And if you can find one that somebody's throwing away, it'd be worth having for your label production. Probably one of the biggest museum faults with typography is putting too much space between the letters, space between the words, and space between the lines. You should be using tight rather than loose form. Letters shouldn't be touching, but they should be very close and snug. And in this example, you can see that the letters are almost touching, and there's about an I, the space of a capital letter I, in between the words. And when you talk about space between the lines, you're measuring from the bottom of one line to the bottom of the bottom of one letter to the bottom of another letter. That's the space between your lines, not the amount of space that's the air between the top of one letter and the bottom of another. Using dark type against a light background gives the best legibility. And this is a nice example of that. Follow familiar uses of type, as you would see in a book or a magazine. A newspaper is not a good example of typography because newspapers are produced so rapidly that they're in a hurry just to get the information out, and they don't spend time lining things up and making the type look attractive. Use books for better models than that. Since readability and legibility are closely associated with familiarity, use type that looks normal, not fancy, not weird, and not with amateurish kind of gimmicks. You can use either ragged right type, which means, as seen in this example with the There She Blows, it's flush left on the left side and ragged on the right. There's also the justified copy. Both of these are readable. Doesn't seem to make a lot of difference one over the other. It's more of a design decision. As are both serif and sans serif type styles. You can choose readable, familiar types from either one of those, either one of the serif or the sans serif type. Some of the most commonly used ones, and you can often find, you can get from your photo typesetter will give you a sample of the type styles that they have available. And some of the most common ones used in the serif type are Times Roman, Palatino, Century Schoolbook, and Garamond. And in sans serif, the readable styles include Helvetica, Optima, Universe, and Avant-Garde. And there are other choices too. Talk to your typesetter. Now, bringing it all together, let's say that you've planned your exhibit, you've selected your themes and artifacts, you've developed an outline, you've grouped your objects into appropriate categories, you've specified your objectives for your audience, you've defined the audience in terms of you've defined the audience that the exhibit is intended for, and you've written your labels according to the style that we've talked about. Now, how do you know if they're effective? Well, the answer to that question, or to get to the answer to that question, is to involve your visitors. If possible, involve them before the exhibit goes up. Try out label copy on a sample of visitors ahead of time and see if they get it. If they don't get it, change the labels until they do get it. Now, just the threat of having to walk out there in the public area and hand somebody, a normal visitor, an average visitor, a piece of copy will make you more honest to begin with, and you'll probably write a better label just thinking about the possibility of doing that. But indeed, try this out on the actual people that are going to be using it, or at least try it out on somebody who doesn't know anything about the subject matter and see if they can understand it. Remember also that when you ask a visitor to look at something and you want to know whether they understand it or not, make it clear to them that if they can't understand it, it's your fault, not their fault. And what you're trying to do is make them be able to understand it by writing a good label. You don't want to force your visitors into feeling like they're being tested and get them all uptight. If the exhibit is already up, observe your visitors objectively. That means you don't just walk out on your way to lunch and sort of glance in the hall and say, oh good, there was somebody reading the label, therefore it's successful. Actually plan a schedule where you take an objective sample of visitors, 10 visitors, 25 visitors, different times of the day, different days of the week, different age groups, different group sizes, to get an overall picture of really what's happening, not just to go out and confirm your own prejudices, because you would want any one of us to be able to go out and come up with the same data. Well, to do this, if the exhibit is already up, is you can unobtrusively observe visitor reading behavior. Now, that means watching from a distance so that the visitor doesn't know that you're observing them. And by the way, reading a label is defined as a sustained gaze in the direction of the label. And this is not 100% accurate. You can find sometimes people will have a sustained gaze in the direction of a label and not be reading, or claim that they did, even when they weren't. You didn't observe them in that way. Anyway, I'd say it's about 90%, at least 90% sure that staring at a label equals reading it. So unobtrusively observe your visitors and watch for the spontaneous label reading behavior. Then intercept the visitor after they've left that label. Introduce yourself, tell them what you're up to, and ask for a brief interview. See if they can recall the label that they read only a few moments ago. If they can't recall anything, the label wasn't memorable. Go back to the drawing board. Try making the label shorter, easier to read, and more relevant to the visual nature of the exhibit, and see if the visitor remembers more. You will have different standards or expectations depending on the kind of label it is and how important the label is. You're not going to have the same standard for every label. 80% readership. That means 80% of the people that you have targeted for this exhibit who stop and read the label is a very high rating. You wouldn't expect 80% for every label. 50% should apply to most captions. If you're aiming for the average visitor, you want 51%. Long technical labels that get read by only a small fraction of the audience are really not justifiable. Your time is better spent on shorter labels that will be used by more people. When planning labels, know what kind of labels you want and know what you want those labels to do in the exhibit. Then make those two things very clear to the visitor, and you'll have good labels. By the way, the biggest and most common mistakes that people can make are to assume too much interest in prior knowledge on the part of the visitors and to want them to learn too much. In this example, it's clear that the exhibit labels are really trying too hard. The whole thing hasn't made up its mind really what's important. Always try to keep it simple and clear to the visitor. That's not playing it safe, it's playing it smart. And in this example, we can see that the title, the introduction, the captions, and the identification labels all have clear purposes and do not compete with each other or the objects on display. So if you can follow these good examples, good luck.